Afternoon, everyone. For our next presentation, I'd like to introduce Pukhraj and Jonathon from Virgin Australia, and they'll be talking about cyber incident response. Please make them feel welcome.
Hello, good afternoon.
Oh, the mic's on.
Awesome. Thank you.
Right. Good afternoon.
Hello.
All right, let's kick on. We're going to talk about setting up an incident response framework using the incident command system. To give you a bit of a pretext here, security operations has evolved a lot over the last couple of years, especially around the strategic parameters that we look at. As preventative and detective controls keep on failing, the onus is more on response. It is of utmost importance to move to response as quickly as possible. And so in a way, security operations or security response is becoming more of a fault tolerance function as to how quickly it can absorb a fault that is an incident and lead towards graceful failure. So that is the conundrum or the challenge that we were dealing with at Virgin Australia, which is a critical infrastructure entity. And we set up a framework or a methodology, which we're going to talk about here, for multi-stakeholder, decentralized, non-linear incident response. A bit of introductions here. I'll introduce Jonathon first.
I'm Jonathon Topham. I have a microphone, don't I? I can talk. So Jonathon Topham, Head of Information Security. My background is not conventional IT. So I come at this from very much a kind of threat actor-centric view of the world. I've been at Virgin for a few years. Prior to that, a lot of service with the UK government. Coming to the private sector was a bit of a strange experience, but there's a lot of commonality in the kind of problems we're trying to solve. So looking at sort of the experience that I had, I found it quite useful coming into the Virgin environment. Pukhraj.
Thank you. I too have a bit of a multidisciplinary background. I've worked in the intelligence community, came back to the private sector, have an alter ego of a geopolitical analyst. So all that kind of like that mishmash of things that we do, it gives us a bit more broader, multidimensional perspectives on problems. That's why we just troped our profiles here. Just wanted to let you know that all those different backgrounds that we have gathered here gives us a different way of looking at the problems. And you come here for the talk, but you'll go away with a lot of memes. So this is one of them.
Yeah, let's make this one clear. Right, everything we say up here is definitely not the opinion of Virgin Australia. Certainly not the meme content. That's very clear. Branson would be very upset.
Now, we'll talk about the problem statement first. There are three sort of broad problems with incident response right now, looking at what's happening around you, especially in the Australian cyber ecosystem. The three problem statements about that incident response is decentralized, it's multi-stakeholder, it's non-linear. Let's touch upon each of them. Let's deconstruct the problem statement a little. We're going to spend probably half of the presentation in deconstructing the problem statement because you'll probably have a few epiphanies as we deconstruct it. And before I go there, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide. Grok is he's a security researcher who sits at the intersection of the security research community. He hasn't fully assimilated into the mainstream community. He's a bit of an old school hacker, and he has this tendency of giving out these one-liners which are pretty phenomenal. So he says that the perimeter is not the boundary of your network, but the boundary of your telemetry. And this he said that after the WannaCry intrusion, WannaCry malware. And I want to focus specifically on WannaCry because what WannaCry did was actually map our real perimeter, which wasn't known to us. It mapped the complexity of networks the way we could not imagine it. So that's why WannaCry is a bit of an emergent property of a complex network, and that's what Grok was hinting at. Another researcher I like to allude to is Halvor Flake, aka Thomas Dullion. He's one of the most renowned malware reverse engineers out there. A lot of the techniques that he invented are still being used now in malware research community. He was one of the pioneers for that. And he went to this geostrategic conference of NATO, SciCon. He gave a keynote there, and he mentioned control and ownership of assets do not necessarily overlap. What you own, you may not control it. And this could be due to a variety of factors, but the key philosophical factor here is that networks are an emergent property. What that really means is that, like a biological system, they are a product of complexity, of cause and effect, which you simply cannot fathom at the outset. Now, in order to put those quotes into context, because of this complex nature of networks, the perimeter has pretty much dissolved. And with the dissolution of the perimeter, we have the decentralization of incident response. And if you ever worked on a third-party breach playbook or a supply chain playbook, you probably know that the key facets of incident response do not really lie with you. You probably don't know, which decisions you need to take at that point in time for incident response, what data is at stake, what's the blast radius. And so the decentralization is not just at the technical level, at the telemetry level, it's probably at the methodological or the strategic level. The operational tier of IR, incident response, may still retain the initiative to some degree, but the tactical and strategic tiers do not. Now, as incident responders, you might sort of still have a defined course of action, pretty well defined. You know what your target states are. You got to do your DFIR, take memory snapshots, do your detection engineering and threat hunting and whatnot. But when you scale it up a notch, when you look at the strategic and the tactical parameters of response, because of this very decentralization, they do not remain under your control. The SOC has ceased to be the center of gravity of incident response for many types of scenarios that we're dealing right now. And look, again, I'll just mention that look what's happening around you. Now, the point I want to highlight is that how's your third-party third-party breach playbook coping with containment, eradication, and recovery? Now, I've already mentioned that. Now, if you ever worked on that kind of playbook, you probably know that you simply cannot ascertain the blast radius. You don't even know where to start with eradication. And recovery, again, is not in your hands until the law firm from a third party gives you the DFIR report that you have been craving for say, 2 months. And that's the nature of modern incident response in a highly emergent environment.
The other aspect of this is stakeholders, right? So how many of you, in the last time you ran an incident, had legal on the call? Show of hands? Nobody going to volunteer? It's all right. Legal are most definitely there. You will find that they also have their own playbooks, depending on what's going on. So if you have a data breach incident, you will have lawyers making decisions, right, and setting the tempo and potentially some of the pace of your response. The interesting aspects of that are it can lead to confusion about who's in charge at any given time, right? And control of an incident and its management can pass between parties at sort of multiple points during that response. So I guess the other aspect of this is that the level as well at which the response is being made, because that imperative that Pukhraj talked about trying to be able to react at speed in a multi-stakeholder environment means that actually you're having to empower people who are relatively junior, right, in the structure. You can't roll up to the CEO or the chief legal officer anymore and say, what's the play? You're actually working with people from across a multiple range of skills, multiple sort of different departments within your organization at multiple different levels in order to try and solve the problem. So you need to be aware of that rigid command and control of the type that many large corporations have used, government loved it, that doesn't necessarily work very well. It actually can lead to more confusion. It can lead to a reduction of pace. It generally can create more problems. I guess, rather than just reading the slide, we identified the need to be able to work more closely in that multi-stakeholder environment and to come to conclusions quicker and work out whether or not, who else we need to include, be able to track the ever-moving sort of progress of an incident and call in the right people to actually get to the right response. Even more important when you start looking at legal obligations around things that are within critical infrastructure. And the other stakeholder that most people forget is actually in the room with you at all times is the aggressor. And sometimes that's true in a really profound way. If you look at some of the briefings that are coming out of CrowdStrike at the moment, some of the events they're running, they are aware of us, they have a vote. It's not always plain sailing and following the playbook.
Let's pick on the point about sort of the adversary also having a say. Now, before we go into the meme, which is a history in the making on its own, I want to talk about the third dimension of cyber incident response. It's non-linear. Now, this is the part where your conventional crisis management structures are breaking. Now, typically speaking, crisis management operates in binaries. It's either activated or it's not. There's very little appreciation of the gray zone of cyber incident response. And there are various reasons behind them, largely socio-political and cultural and the kind of threat environment that we had. Now, they are used to, and we have experience working with some of the best crisis management teams in the world. And what we have seen is that sheer linear nature of incident response when it comes to crisis management, because they come from the world of counterterrorism, hijackings, air crashes in the industry that we are at. And that applies to pretty much every industry in the critical infrastructure sector. And for them to appreciate the very fact that the way we understand cyber incident response is nonlinear is a lot to fathom. Now, of course, we deal with hypotheses. We start with a couple of hypotheses. We analyze these competing hypotheses, and we narrow down on one or two, and we attribute a certain level of probability to this hypothesis. Okay, this would have happened, and this is what we need to do. And by that time, clock is already running out. Your notification obligations have kicked in. And so you narrow down on a most probable hypothesis. And that's how we pursue incident response in cyber, right? And that doesn't really gel well with crisis management functions. And there's this subtle tension between the non-linearity of cyber incident response and the linearity of crisis management team, as I already highlighted. Now, another factor I'd like to sort of introduce here is now what is crisis management? Crisis management is really an amalgamation or convergence of all the response functions that you really need in incident response. So it has your public affairs, your corporate communications, and everything else that's required as a part of that flexible response function. Now, if you look at that, crisis management, because of the sheer linear philosophy of theirs, they cannot accommodate the fact that the narrative or the organizational narrative may not be under your control. And so this is what you have seen happening recently in the breaches that have happened in Australia, that someone delivers a message to the public, and the adversary just drops in with their own public messaging system and say, well, whatever the message was, the message would be that we're still evaluating if any sensitive data was touched. And the adversary is like, here you go. Here's your personal information. And so that kind of accommodation of adversaries' information operations hasn't happened because the typical conventional crisis management function cannot even fathom that the adversary has a seat in your situation room, which Jonathon alluded to. And the last point is that now what this really leads to is a disaster in the making if you don't align your technical incident response functions with your tactical and strategic functions. It could lead to an irreparable damage when it comes to your reputation, and that's what we have seen happening. And I largely personally attribute it to that lack of convergence in the linear and the non-linear mentality of these competing functions trying to work together during incident response.
Yeah, it's probably worth adding to that some of the objectives and that the various parties involved in that response are somewhat running counter to each other. So IT typically is in disaster recovery mode if there's been an outage. They want to get everything back up and running. They've got a linear pathway for doing that. It's where from conversations we've had with our suppliers and with other people within sort of industry around their thoughts around this. Not that linear pathway to recovery doesn't always mitigate the risk that you're actually trying to deal with. So, through the investigation, you might find that the attack is not just knocking a few servers down, encrypting them. We have to recover from backup. It might actually be, we now got to check the integrity of that data before we can turn it back on. So whilst somebody's completed their linear path, we may have actually found an entire other pathway of activity that we need to go down. And that makes people potentially quite uncomfortable because they've got their playbook, they've got their DR, they've got their SLAs, they've got everything agreed. And it really does mess with other people's game plans. So actually having those conversations, bringing them on board is incredibly important because these things do twist and turn for a variety of reasons that Pukhraj has gone over here around the adversary, just our understanding and the instrumentation that we have available to us at any given time.
And just a 5-second homage to the meme. This was a fight between the fruit sellers in India. It was picked up by an Aussie person. He's a social media personality and gave this hilarious commentary on that fight. And so it's just a snippet of that interesting fight. Now, we have addressed the problem statement here. Now we're going to talk about what we came up with. O.T. Johnson.
Do you want me to do it? Yeah. So we drew on sort of government experience about how you deal with large, unwieldy, sometimes poorly defined incidents, and started looking back at sort of how, should we say, larger government, better funded organizations actually looked at this problem and tried to solve it. Some of the sort of the philosophies they utilized, and then sort of worked out whether or not they are actually relevant to us. So we started off with FEMA, so Federal Emergency Management Agencies, National Incident Management System. That grew out of 9/11. If you've read the 9/11 Commission report, if anybody ever gets a chance to, sit down, read it. It's fascinating. The lack of interoperability between different agencies, the information exchange, all the confusion. It's a really, really interesting take on how response to that incident, when nobody really knew what was going on or the extent of it, how that shaped American thinking on how you manage a major incident. And the UK government, given my accent, unsurprising, how incident command and control works within large incidents. And then there's a structure, gold, silver, bronze command structure that is used throughout UK government for all sorts of things that we'll talk a lot more about in a minute.
And the key factor which these frameworks accommodate is modularity. We'll talk about that in a second, but especially in the sector we are, in a matter of, say, hours, a typical incident could be from being a whole of department incident, it could quickly evolve into being a whole of organization to a whole of sector and even a whole of nation incident. So the flexibility of the command and control that's required to address that kind of sheer scale of an incident is probably accommodated by these frameworks, and that's the key. Those are the key factors that we looked at. Now, we'll talk about the first system that we alluded to, that's Federal Emergency Management Authority's Incident Command System, also called the National Incident Management System now. Now, if you look at the key principles, these are the kind of like the foundational tenets of that framework. Of course, it affords flexibility. Now, of course, there's a lot of devil in the details, but the sheer fact that your command and control has to be evolving, it has to adapt to the nature of the situational awareness around the incident is a challenge, is a real challenge when you have so many competing response functions trying to work together. And so it helps you create that underlying foundation to accommodate that. Standardization, what it may mean standardization of your taxonomy. It could mean standardization of your interfaces. Whom do you need to talk to during a certain phase of the incident life cycle, and how? Information. How do you need to convey information? Am I using a SITREP template, or is a phone call enough? It kind of like sets that kind of structural foundation of standardization. It doesn't have to be rigorous. It doesn't have to be really learned in a rote way, but it sets those foundations for that. Unity of effort, needless to say, self-explanatory, but the fact that now the key driver of cyber incident response is the technical team, the SOC, which is whose center, while its center of gravity is diminishing, but it still holds all the truths, the key truths, established truths around a certain incident. Now, how do you maintain unity of effort between, say, the sheer ambiguity of the narrative which technical incident response capture with, say, the certainty which, say, strategic incident response might need? And so that unity of effort, how does it get reflected is, again, one of the foundational principles there. Now, some characteristics. Now, these are not all the characteristics of the incident command system of FEMA. These are just some of them which we thought are important, but there are far others you can refer to. Model organization. Exactly, we talked about that. How do you scale it up? How do you only pick people whom you need during a specific phase of an incident life cycle? And how do you kick others out, because it just adds to the noise. Management by objectives, we talked about that. Are we driven by your threat hunts? Are we driven by your memory snapshots? Or are we actually driven by business continuity measures to keep the aircrafts flying? Or are we driven by regulatory obligations which require us to notify the regulators in say 16 hours or something like that? So how do we manage it by objectives is also accommodated by this framework. Integrated communications, we talked about that. The adversary has a seat in a situation room. You are part of a large adversarial information operation campaign, and so how do you streamline technical and strategic messaging into a wholesome product? Establishment and transfer of command, we'll talk about that in a bit. This is probably the most crucial element. Who establishes command and how does it get transferred? And the instantiation of that command itself is probably the most crucial bit for managing this multi-stakeholder model of incident response.
So on that concept of how do you manage command and control and that transfer of command and control between people, UK's incident command structure facilitates that. So there are a variety of levels. I know it seems funny coming from an airline talking about gold, silver, and bronze levels. It's a bit loyalty, isn't it? The idea that you have functional levels. You have a bronze level at the tactical level, solving the problem. You have this silver level in the middle, which can provide an augmented decision making depending on what risk is required and what kind of the risk appetite effectively, and gold on top, which does the same sort of thing for silver, overall accountability for a situation. So it allows you, by having a common structure, it allows you to integrate really, really well, because everybody knows what level they're supposed to be talking to. Everybody knows who's running what at any given time, and transfers of command typically occur within a level. So everybody knows who's in charge, who's got the mic, and who should be operating anything at any given time. So it's a pretty good intellectual model to bring in to a system to try and solve that problem of how do you determine who's in charge at any given time, and how do you maintain that interoperability between teams?
Now, to give a certain context to how this structure is useful, just a quick example there. The key challenge is that, say, during cyber incident response, detection and validation is purely a technical measure. And on the other hand, the initial assessment team of the crisis management team might be asking you, should I initiate the crisis management function or not? Should I activate or not? And so this kind of like those, the bronze, silver, and gold system actually accommodates that instantiation of the gradual instantiation of the command system. So in a way, you can actually still be, you're able to accommodate the initial technical uncertainty around the nature of an incident and have a kind of like a messaging system or a communication interface with the crisis management team, because it operates in binaries, and you have a space to maneuver, yet you have an interface with the crisis management team, and you can, at a certain point in time, tell them, okay, this is DEFCON 1, let's activate the crisis management team, and then the larger function kicks in. It has that accommodation of flexibility there. Now, we wanted to, so as we delved into this, the sheer complexity of this was around 2 years ago, before all these big ticket breaches happened. But we knew that something like that is in the offing, and we wanted to prepare for that kind of those kind of scenarios. And so the first few things that we sort of wanted to solve by inspired by these national level frameworks is, of course, the integration of, now we actually have multiple sister response functions running together, which want to run together. Data breach response plan, which is obligated to respond to the regulator under the Privacy Act. Now they got their own kill chain, which is actually, if I use the term, which is slightly different from, say, our kill chain. Now, that fusion is required between these two sister functions And so that requires that, the modular command system was really helpful in managing that fusion of different disparate kill chains. Critical IT incident management generally kicks in during eradication, response, and recovery, especially for a mission, operationally driven organization. Crisis management, we talked about it a lot. So it's just that fusion of these interfaces, how do we address that? So we looked at the integration, and the way we looked at integration is by focusing on one tuple containing 3 dimensions: information, interfaces, and decisions. What information needs to be conveyed, what interfaces need to be enabled, and who needs to take the decision at a certain point in time across the kill chain. That's what we focused on. Now, of course, we looked at what are the drivers, what does management by objectives mean here. Now, my objective could be, to establish the blast radius, to capture all the forensic snapshots that I want for, my investigation, to establish the long tail of an incident. Or it could be just making sure that business continuity measures kick in as soon as possible at the loss of certain evidence. Or it could be that we have to preserve certain forensics evidence so that the regulators whom we need to notify, we are able to corroborate what we saw. So these are conflicting kind of objectives that we had to accommodate, and you could actually map them across the kill chain and kind of like deconstruct them with the modular command system. Another thing which I wanted to mention is that because we are a highly sort of operational organization, all of the response functions are highly mature, world-class. And so what we didn't want to do is actually let them change their procedures and protocols. No, that's not what we wanted to do. We wanted to have a function which is almost invisible in a way until it's noticed, and it's able to just plug and play with the other sister response functions that we had.
So, in keeping with that airline loyalty platform management sort of structure, gold, silver, bronze. We adopted the same language and the structure. So what you have effectively is a bronze level that is effectively running all the time, right? Because we're constantly looking for things. We're constantly responding to events that appear within our systems. We're investigating. We're doing all that sort of work, which is a constant running process. We have effectively then stakeholders who work at that level also in other kind of areas of the business. So you have your IT people who are monitoring IT performance and everything else. You've got people at the front line looking at sort of social media, other sorts of information that might lead us to understand that there's actually an incident we need to dig into. Silver sits above that, which is sort of a more of a risk assessment and evaluation step. Back to sort of Pukhraj's comment there around being able to kick off total organization crisis management solution processes. You have the solution we came to was that we did not want to just step immediately from there's something, I've got an alert on my SIEM, run the flag up the pole, we're DEFCON 1 now, crisis management team's going to stand up. That doesn't work. You very quickly you've call wolf too many times, but also you oversaturate all those other processes. So you needed something in the middle. So that silver command and control gives a point of escalation to understand and evaluate risk and to make some decisions about, okay, can we respond to that incident in a tactical way, or do we need to move to something strategic? That gold level is where you have your C-suite, right, effectively. And that does not necessarily mean directly pushed into crisis management, but it's at that point, because of the level of risk you're talking about, somebody needs to make a decision. Now, there is nothing to stop us from escalating straight to CMT if we want to, with effectively everybody else CC'd into that. But it gives you stratification of problem solving and decision making. That means you don't have to put the flag up all the way, straight away, in order to evaluate what actually is going on, which is one of the problems that certainly other organizations have been around have had. So it's sort of a graduated response. It also means you can bounce backwards and forwards. So once you find that actually there is nothing that's particularly scary there, you can manage the response at an appropriate level that keeps the number of people in the room to a right level and allows you to manage it gracefully.
Now, once we had drawn up the foundations, or I would call it a skeletal sort of framework for the incident command system of our organization, we we did not deliberate upon the, the philosophical underpinnings of it. We just went ahead and did a tabletop exercise or a few, and we learned some lessons there. Now, a lot of the lessons actually capture the elements of operationalization of this framework. Now, some of the lessons which I wanted to share, because it just helps you, minimize the confusion how this has to be established. Now, we worked with it, like I'll give an example, that the team of consultants that we brought on to help us with the definition of this framework. Initially, they sort of conveyed that this function is not feasible. The incident command system is not feasible to be operationalized. And so I convinced them to actually start working on its instantiation. And so we learned a few lessons from that. Now, first of all, the key lesson here is do not expose gold, silver, and bronze to your sister response function. It's too confusing. It just feels like a bit of a pecking order as well, and just can really derail their existing terminology and taxonomy of incident response. So, and if you think of it, it doesn't need to be exposed. Nobody needs to know who silver and bronze is. It doesn't have to be part of your communication with other response functions, because as we talked about it earlier, the three key dimensions across where your incident response works is interfaces. You need to define the interfaces. You need to convey the right information, and you need to know who needs to take the decision. And that's all you need really to understand, what does goal map to. Now, rigorously test the instantiation of ICS first. Do not aim for the moon. So, before you actually start thinking about what my end game is, or how this command system is going to be, brought down, you just focus on testing its instantiation. With instantiation, you'll at least know, are the right interfaces established? Are we able to communicate correctly, and decisions are being taken? Even it's a victory, because after that you have a couple of states, and you can take certain decisions around where you want to head to. But if you focus on instantiation, that will solve 90% of the confusion around such a framework. Now, do not change the roles and responsibilities of the participants within other IR plans. To give an example, like there was a bit of confusion as to where does the CIO sit. Is CIO our gold, or is it the incident commander of the IT response function? So you have the ability to actually define what the goal tier is meant to do, and it's not an exclusive accommodation within our command system. The goal tier is basically an interlocutor with other response function, which affords the flexibility to the goal tier to still chair other response meetings. And we'll come to what happens later, because you simply cannot have multiple response functions up and running. And we're almost to the last slide. So to extend from the previous lessons learned, when you hit certain inflection points, when you know that you have actually established the ground truths around an incident, maybe it's time to actually fuse into some other response framework. To give an example, if you address your notification obligations, or what you need to tell to the regulators at initially the first notification and stuff like that, you want to move towards containment, eradication, recovery. And at that point in time, your incident command system can easily be merged or absorbed by IT incident response framework, because that kind of accommodation of absorption of one incident response framework into another should be accommodated. It doesn't need to be stood up all the time. Do not be too hung up over who gets gold, silver, and bronze. No, it's not a pecking order. Like, to give an example, again, if this is a privacy dominant, if a specific incident has more impact in terms of privacy obligations, the silver tier can be taken over by a group privacy officer instead of it being handled by the head of information security. So it's more about the person required for that role and the right strategic mandate than the designation itself. And those are the key suggestions we have taken from our table of exercise. Jonathon, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just following on that thing around the who gets silver, it's more to do with risk, right? Who has actually got the authority to absorb more of that risk? Usually, yeah, it's seniority, but there are certain areas of the business that have more accountability for risk than others. So it is functional. It is about the ability to absorb and manage risk.
Beautiful. We're almost on time. We wanted to accommodate some time for questions.
Did we have any questions? Does anyone want to think of a question real quick? I don't think we had any questions in the app as well. So if there are no questions, could everyone please give it up for Pukhraj and Jonathon?
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you very much.